Oh, that would make a big difference. Thank you, Valis, for pointing that out to me. Hello, dear listeners. This is Vex and Cat. I am returning to C.S. Evans and Arthur Rackham's special editions of Sleeping Beauty today. We spoke about Cinderella and read the entirety of that version on Wednesday. Today we're going to focus on Sleeping Beauty. I did want to talk about, again, how beautiful the artwork is from Arthur Rackham. I don't need to go too deep into the weeds on on this subject because, like I said, I waxed eloquently about both the artist and the writer on Wednesday. I did want to talk a little bit about the history of Sleeping Beauty, just a smidge. You still can't hear me. Mic check, check, check. One, two. If you can hear me, say hello. Nothing? Nothing. Nothing. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Nothing? Nothing? See? Thank you, Darth. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Scuffed from the beginning. Gotta love it on a Friday. So let's try this again. From the top, it is yours truly, Vexing Cat, on the microphone. Welcome back to my library, and today we will be discussing Sleeping Beauty. In particular, we'll be discussing the version of Sleeping Beauty by Arthur Rackham and C.S. or Charles Seddon Evans. I did want to just touch on Sleeping Beauty in its history, just briefly. Um, but I already waxed eloquently about both Mr. Evans and Mr. Rackham on Wednesday, so I don't need to go too deep into the weeds on that. But I did want to talk about some of the origin of the story of Sleeping Beauty, similar to Cinderella, where it had multiple sources over many, many years. It could be cited. So, like Aschenputtel, which was the Brothers Grimm version. Specifically, I am talking about Cinderella, but Cinderella, there was the Charles Perrault version, which was French. There's Aschenputtel, which is the German version. There was an Italian version. Um, a lot of history. Greek. Just multiple cultures, like hundreds of versions of Cinderella in some iteration. Some very, very dark, very, very violent, and some more effervescent and delightful. Um, the origin of Sleeping Beauty is very dark. There is a lot of stories where Sleeping Beauty was non consensually um, abused by a prince or a king while she was sleeping. The earliest version that can be attributed or possibly might be the origin of Sleeping Beauty is Die Valkyrie. So Richard Wagner, Richard Wagner has this opening suite, The Ring of Nibelung. So during this, Wotan casts a magic spell on Brunhilde, and she sleeps for a whole generation. She's like in the woods on this large, um, I don't know what I would call it, like a slab. She's on this large stone slab. Brunhilde is asleep for a whole generation. And similarly, Sleeping Beauty is pricked by a spindle and magically falls asleep for 100 years. So the first printed version in 1528 is about 350 years older than The Valkyrie by Richard Wagner. So he produced that in 1873, and they both come from the same source. So the 1528 and the 1873 Sleeping Beauties come from the Volsunga saga, or the Icelandic prose saga that tells of the origins and the decline of the Volsunga clan. Now, that in that saga, Sigurd and Brunhilde is in her magic sleep, and it's Sigurd that wakes her. Right now, in the Norse saga, this narrative is in the form of poetry, and it's using the saga's plot or the Ring of the Nibelung, um, stringing the four cycles into an opera. That's what Wagner was able to do with that story. Whereas the scholar Maria Tatar says that this source of the Sleeping Beauty was what was used later in the the Brothers Grimm version, the annotated version. Now, I would say that though those various versions of this story, a woman sleeping due to magic of some kind and being awoken by true love's kiss, or her lover the prince or the king or whoever it is it's a tale that's been told over and over again. Um, there's like French versions, Greek versions. Um, one of the one of the ones that I'm not a huge fan of, um, the Italian version, she is asleep, stays asleep, is impregnated by the king, and it's not until her twin children are born, and one of them is able to suckle on her finger and draw the flax seed from her finger before she awakens. And then she's got like, I got kids now, okay. Um, but the spindle, the flax, the, various foreign matter stuck into the Sleeping Beauty's finger seems to be the key point, and then the magic is putting her to sleep until she's awakened in some form or manner. Um, I think of all the versions of Sleeping Beauty that I'm most familiar with, it'd probably be the Charles Perrault version, the French version that happened in 1697, which I think is possibly the origin of where Disney got their version of Sleeping Beauty. Um, so in that version, it's a dramatic turn from her like unconsenting lovers to a fall in love with the person who kisses her awake situation. So the prince is single, he marries Sleeping Beauty. So in that version, he leaves his family, so his wife and children, Sleeping Beauty, with his mother, who's an ogress. She's cannibalistic. When the prince is called to battle, the queen orders Sleeping Beauty or Beauty to make a meal of her children. So it's still dark, but in a different way. Um, but she hides the children and replaces them with animals. In the end, the prince, aka the king, catches his mother in the act of trying to kill his family, and instead, she, the I guess the mother of the king, is put to death instead. So Perrault removed the non-consent from the tale and instead included a cannibalistic bent, which is a different kind of dark, and too dark for children. Um, but then, like in 1812, Brothers Grimm removed the cannibalism, and it's like each revision takes away uh, the original part of the story. And I don't know if it necessarily makes it better, but it definitely makes it more relatable to modern interpretation and modern stories. So I do like that the Grimms added the kiss that brought her back to life. It's more respectful. It's dignified, um, as opposed to some of the other versions that have not good things. Anyway, so enough about the history of Sleeping Beauty. Let's get into the meat and potatoes. Hopefully, there's not any strange words, but if there are, we'll learn about them together. Let's see here. I did want to show some of the artwork. So here's the um, entry pages like in against the hardcover, so the first page, and this was submitted to the Hearst Memorial Library and then later added to the Library Congress. In this edition of the deluxe printed English made version, this was printed in 1920, so a year after the Cinderella one. So as you can see, Arthur Rackham, again, mwah, delightful artwork. Here we have Beauty about to prick her finger on the spindle. We have an owl, a squirrel, this briar rose theme border detail all around the images, and prancing common folk and aristocrats and who knows who. Like, we've got the girl at the very beginning of the line prancing with her skirts and her fingers, and then shh behind you, and a lot of shushing because perhaps she's tiptoeing to past Beauty's room. I don't know. Um, let's see here. So here's another image. This one's a little bit darker. In this image, we can see the briar brambles have overtaken the castle, and two princes in costly garb and a knight are entangled and have probably perished. I'm guessing at least the princes have perished in the brambles. So here in this picture, we can really see Sleeping Beauty and the curse that's overlaid upon her, and her resting possibly for eternity on that bed. Her crown is on the ground. You know, everything about this is dark and a little macabre. And then here we are at the beginning where it's once upon a time. So, The Sleeping Beauty, Chapter 1. Once upon a time there was a king and a queen who were very unhappy because they had no children. Everything else that the heart could wish for was theirs. They were rich, they lived in a wonderful palace full of the costliest treasures, their kingdom was at peace, and their people were prosperous. Yet none of these things contented them, because they wanted a little child of their own to love and to care for, and though they had been married several years, no child had come to them. Every day the king would look at the queen and say, "Ah, if only if we only had a little child." And the queen would look at the king and sigh, and they were both very miserable about it. Then they would put on their golden crowns and sit side by side on their thrones, while lords and ladies and ambassadors from other lands came to pay them homage. And they had to smile with their lips for the sake of politeness, but there was no joy in their hearts. And that is one of the greatest disadvantages of being a king or a queen, that one has always to hide one's feelings. Now, it happened one day that the queen went to her bath, and having dismissed her ladies, she descended. Here she is, having taken her bath and descending, and her lady-in-waiting picking up her crown, descended the marble steps into the water, and began idly to play with some wild rose petals which had fallen into the water. All of a sudden she heard a croaking voice that said,
"O Queen, be cheerful, for the dearest wish of your heart will be granted you."
"Who is that?" cried the queen, a little frightened, for she could see nobody.
"Look behind you,"
croaked the voice,
"and do not be afraid, for I come only to bear you good tidings."
So the queen looked behind her, and there was a great frog who looked at her with its big round eyes. Now, the queen was afraid of frogs because they are cold and clammy, but she was very polite by nature as well as breeding, so she did not show her dislike, though she could not help shrinking back a little. Over on the right you can see the actually I'm going to pull up that image here. I like how the fountain is like pouring water in the frog. And there she is with the sponge, like, oh, what are you doing? There's a talking frog. It's just cute. And do you tell me, Master Frog, said she, that I shall have the wish of my heart, and do you know what that wish may be?
It is to have a little small child of your own,
said the frog, and the queen nodded.
Very well.
The frog went on.
Do you see the green leaves of that almond tree on the branch by the window?
I do, replied the queen wonderingly.
Those green leaves will fade,
said the frog,
and the winter winds will blow them away. Then the branch will be bare, but in springtime, before the leaves come again, it will be covered with pink blossoms, and that blossom you shall show to a baby lying at your breast.
The queen gave a cry of joy. A ray of sunlight came through the trees, dazzling her eyes, so that she had to close them for a moment. When she opened them again, the frog had gone, and nothing was to be seen but the dainty rose petals floating on the surface of the water. Not a bad first chapter. We are on to chapter 2. That is a very frightened cat. No title for this one. I'll have a bit of a drink since croaking frog voice was a little rough. Those were wonderful tidings to be spoken by a frog who came, no one knew whence, and went no one knew whither. But the queen believed that the prophecy would prove true, and she was right, for when the springtime came again and the almond blossom was pink upon the pink upon the bough, she gave birth to a little daughter who was so beautiful that nobody had ever seen her like. Now what joy there was in the hearts of everybody in the palace! The king was so excited that he went into council in his dressing gown instead of his royal robe, and he did not care a bit when his courtiers smiled. There was coming and going in all the halls and corridors. Couriers on swift horses were sent out to bear the glad news to the most distant parts of the kingdom. Oh, thank you so much, Hagara. That was so kind of you. I appreciate that, and I hope that Darth HD and Fruity Musu get to enjoy those gifted subs. Thank you so much. Couriers on swift horses were sent out to bear the glad news to the most distant parts of the kingdom. All the bells in the churches were rung, flags were put out in the houses, and streamers were hung across the roadways. Then the cannons were fired, bang, 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 to tell the people that everybody was to have a holiday, so that all, from the highest to the lowest, might rejoice in the Queen's happiness. Here is everyone having a holiday, dancing in the street, the cannons in the background, firing, bang, bang, bang. Everyone's excited, the streamers. It's beautiful. Never was there such a beautiful child, said the king, looking down at his daughter as she lay in her mother's arms. He wanted very much to nurse her, but this could not be allowed, because men are so clumsy with babies. What? I'm sorry. What? Okay. I think that's the first time that I've had to read a line in a book and thought, that's sexist, but towards men instead of women. It's interesting for the period of time. 1920s, what can I say? What shall her name be? Said the king, and he suggested all the grandest names he could call to mind. for though he thought that such a wonderful child must certainly have a name to suit. But the queen would have none of them. She shall be called Briar Rose, said the queen, and so it was arranged. A few weeks later, the christening took place. That was a splendid ceremony, to be sure, for all the lords and ladies of the kingdom were present in their richest dresses. Together with princes and ambassadors from distant countries, the little princess was as good as gold all the time. She did not cry once, but opened her big blue eyes and smiled at the glittering company as though she understood everything that was going on. Before I continue on, you can see all of the children climbing in the trees, super excited. All the cheering, everyone's happy for the naming day ceremony. Outside the cathedral, the roads were crowded with people waiting to see the guests come and go. The carriages extended for nearly a mile, and as they drove away, headed by the royal coach, in which the queen sat with the Princess Briar Rose in her arms. The spectators took off their hats and shouted and cheered. Some of the little boys perched themselves on the branches of trees and the lamp posts in order to get a better view, and I have been told that there was one poor woman who saw nothing at all, because her boy tried to climb up to an inn sign, where he dangled in such a dangerous position that his poor old mother had to stand with her back to the procession, holding on to his legs in a terrible state of anxiety, lest he should fall. At the palace, a magnificent feast had been prepared. Now it was the custom in those days when a king's child was christened for all the fairies in the country to be invited to the christening feast. Each fairy was bound to bring a gift, so of course it stood to reason that the royal child would have everything that a heart could possibly desire. There were 13 fairies in the king's realm, but one of them lived in a lonely place on the outskirts of the kingdom. There, for the last 50 years, she had shut herself up in a ruined tower with only a black cat to keep her company, and as she kept herself to herself, everybody had forgotten her very existence. The result was that she was not invited to the christening feast, and though she had nobody but herself to blame for this, she was very angry about it. The truth of the matter is that she was always a miserable, sour creature, with no love or kindness in her heart, and nobody missed her because she had never given anybody any reason to care for her. Well, the guests assembled in the banqueting hall of the palace, and the feast began. So there's the miserable fairy who's locked up in her tower, keeping herself to herself. We've got some beautiful details here. Open that image. I just love, like, we have these cobwebs and these overgrown plants and the crickety door and the window with the black cat. You can really see. So this would have been traditional lino cut, I believe, printing. That's why there's this kind of halo around, what would I call that? The tower. There's a little line around the cat and the tower, and also along the cuts around where the plants are over here on the left. So this process of taking a piece of linoleum, a piece of linoleum or rubber pad, woodcut. Judging by the way the inking is on this structure, I would say this was linoleum. Um, you go in with a carving knife and you actually cut away and in relief. So anything black is raised and not cut, and then anything white here is been cut away so that when you print this image, it'll leave that impression. And that's why where the edges were of the cutting, if you press too hard, you'll leave that kind of ghost imprint in the artwork. So, anyway, I digress. We are 2 chapters in, so I think just take a second. Welcome anybody that wasn't here before. Hello, I am Vexing Cat. Today we're doing Sleeping Beauty as retold by Charles Seddon Evans and illustrated by Arthur Rackham. Kind of cruising through these chapters already. But I will get started on chapter 3. Again, I think aside from that once upon a time at the very beginning, I don't believe any of the chapters have titles. So, let's see. Oh, and before I forget, if you just want to lurk and listen, just so that I know that you're here, feel free to engage and just do an exclamation lurk. Just so that way I know you're here. Chapter 3. The king and the queen sat on a dais. Is it dais? Dais. I don't know. Hang on. I've never thought to look that up. I've always read it, and now I need to know what it is. I know what it is, but how do I say it? Dais. It is dais. Okay. I wasn't wrong. Good to know. The king and the queen sat on a dais at the end of the banqueting hall, and above them in a little gallery there was a band of fiddlers and flute players. On either side of the royal pair sat the 12 fairy godmothers, 6 on the right hand and 6 on the left. In front of each fairy was a golden plate and a golden casket made to hold her knife, fork, and spoon. These caskets were beautifully carved and engraved, and each one was of a different shape. One was the form of a ship, another a shell, a third in the form of a castle with turrets, and so on and so on. Nothing more beautiful could be imagined, for they had all been specially made for the occasion by the cleverest goldsmiths in the kingdom, and they were the king's presents to the fairy godmothers. He felt very proud when the fairies spoke admiringly of these caskets, and said that they would be pleased to accept them. Below the dais were 6 long tables for the guests, and there was only just room between the tables for the servants to pass, so you may judge how crowded the room was. Such a glittering of silks, such a flashing of jewels, such a dazzle and splendor had never been seen since the time of the king's coronation, and all the guests were laughing and talking merrily. The court painter was there, of course, to make a picture of the gorgeous scene, and was kept so busy sketching on his tablets that he had no time to get any food, though probably he had a good meal afterwards. And the nice things there were to eat. There were forced meatballs flavored with rare spices from the East, sardines from Sardinia, tunny fish from the Mediterranean, and sturgeon from Russia, steaming boar's heads with lemons in their mouths, turkeys, peacocks, and swans, ortolans, wonderful roasts and delicious stews, roe deer and bear's hams. What is an ortolan? Did I misspell it? Ortolan? Bunting. And beer the bobolink? What? Como se va? Ortolan. Okay. An old world bunting. What is a bunting? As far as I'm aware, bunting is the process in which you wrap a baby. patriotic and festive decoration made of such as cloth, yada yada. The more you know. All right then. Sweets in all sorts of curious shapes, as for instance, cakes like castles with little men made of sweet stuff for sentries on the battlements, each complete in gilded armor and with a halberd over his shoulder, a rare sight. And eagles carved of ice hovered over silver dishes filled with apricots. Then followed the smaller dishes, tiny cakes as white and delicate as ladies' fingers, birds' nests made of spun sugar, and in the nests were eggs of marshmallow, and in each egg was a tiny chicken made of caramel, figs and dates from the dessert, other fruits in and out of season, syrups and preserves fetched from the four corners of the world, wines cooled in snow from the distant mountains. One might fill pages merely by setting down the names of all the delicacies. Each day was brought in, each dish was brought in by the servants in a kind of procession, headed by the master cook, looking as grand and solemn as an archbishop, for he was a grave and dignified person, and of course he had a great responsibility. The guests were served by little page boys of noble birth, dressed in the liveries of their masters, and these pages handed the dishes and the wines most politely on their bended knees, as they had been taught to do. So the guests enjoyed themselves, and the fiddlers played, and the king laughed at everything everybody said, because he was in a mighty good humor. And the bright afternoon sun, shining through the western windows, lighted up the rich hangings on the walls, and flashed upon the jewels on the fair lady's fingers, and fell upon the marble pavement in a pool of gold. And then, you know, when the merriment was at its height, something happened. There was a sudden cry, and a harsh voice, like the croaking of a raven, sounded through the room.
"Be merry, my lords and ladies," cried the voice. "Laugh while you may, but remember that tears may follow laughter."
A hush fell upon the brilliant assembly. The queen turned pale and shuddered. The king rose hurriedly from his place, and he and all the guests turned to look at the strange figure that had suddenly appeared in the doorway. They saw an old woman, bent almost double with age, her gray head, with matted hair, sunk deep between her shoulders. Her face was white and twisted with anger, and her green eyes flashed spitefully. Slowly she advanced towards the dais, and stretching out her arm, pointed her finger at the gold plates and the gold casket set before the fairy godmothers.
"There's one,"
said she, with a hoarse laugh.
"There's two. There's 12. Did you not know, O king, that there were 13 wise women in your kingdom, and the 13th the wisest and most powerful of all? Where, then, is the plate and the casket set for me?"
The king began to make excuses, imploring the angry old fairy to forgive him for his neglect, and begging her to sit down and join them in their festivities. "For," said he, "I am sure you are very welcome."
"Is it so, indeed?"
said the 13th fairy.
"I am not too late, then, though the feast is all but done. I shall eat off silver while my sisters eat off gold, and there is no curiously shaped casket for me. No matter. I am content because I am in time, and I shall dower the princess with a gift which I have brought for her."
And here the spiteful creature uttered another of her sneering laughs, which made the blood of all the guests run cold. By dint of much coaxing, the king at last managed to persuade her to sit down, and the feast proceeded. But a chill had been cast over the assembly, and nothing was quite the same as it had been before. The old crone muttered and mouthed over her food, now and again smiling to herself, as though she were christening some secret and evil triumph. The other fairies cast anxious glances at her, for they feared her malice, and the youngest fairy of all, who happened to be seated at the end of the table, presently rose up quietly from her place, and stealing away, hid herself behind the arras. And nobody saw her go, nor did a single person remark upon her absence. Well, done fucked around and found out, for realsies. Um, welcome in. Let's see here. Pause that, open that, close that. Okay. Um, bear with me just a second. I'm gonna go ahead and refill my water bottle. The harsh frog and wicked fairy godmother voice is a little bit rough on the old throat. So I will be right back. So, toodles! No ad though, I'll just be right back. Okay, and we are back. Hi, Fallen. Welcome in. Uh, I'm not sure if you caught the first couple chapters, but welcome in. So we are on to chapter 4, and judging by the ominous vibe of this individual that is above the chapter, I'm going to say that's probably the evil fairy, the 13th fairy. So let's get started on chapter 4. And now came the time for the most important part of the ceremony, when the fairy godmothers should declare their gifts to the royal child. All this time, the little Princess Briar Rose had been quietly sleeping in her cradle in the nursery, watched over by an old servant who had tended her mother as a child. Now, the king gave orders for the baby to be brought into the banqueting hall. The guests ceased their laughter and talk, and the musicians laid by their instruments. So, the sleeping child was brought and placed in her mother's arms. How tenderly she clasped the baby to her breast, bending over it as though to shield it from all harm. So sweet a sight should have touched the hardest heart, and indeed there was only one person in the room who remained unmoved, and that was the spiteful and jealous fairy, who looked up and bared her yellow teeth in a sneering grin.
Queen, said she, your face is pale and your lips tremble. What is it that you fear on this day of the giving of gifts?
But the queen shuddered and was silent, when a fairy rose in her place and said, I will begin. My gift to the Princess Briar Rose is the gift of beauty. She shall have eyes like stars and hair as bright as the sunshine of the spring day on which she was born, and cheeks as fresh and fair as the petals of the flower from which she takes her name. None shall surpass her in loveliness. Then the second fairy rose in her turn and said, after beauty, wit. The princess shall be cleverer than any ordinary mortal could ever hope to be. I give her virtue, said the third, and the queen nodded her head and smiled, for though she esteemed beauty and cleverness, she knew that neither was of any worth without goodness of heart. So all the fairies in turn named the gift which they had brought for Briar Rose. The fourth said that whatever the princess put her hand to, she should do with the most exquisite grace. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. The sixth, that she should dance as lightly. Oh, here she is, the queen. We have the fairy in the background disappearing, and we have the evil 13th fairy, like accusatory of the queen, with her sneering grin. And of course, the king, the queen, and all the knights behind them, holding Princess Briar Rose in her arms. The sixth said that she should dance as lightly as a fairy, and so on until she had nearly all the virtues and accomplishments which even a king might desire for his daughter. But as yet, the spiteful old fairy had not said a word. At last she rose and cast an evil glance round.
Have you all finished?
Said she.
Hear then my wish. On the day when she reaches her 15th birthday, the princess shall prick her finger with the spindle of a spinning wheel, and shall immediately die.
This terrible prophecy made the whole company shudder. The queen gave a cry and hugged the sleeping baby still closer to her breast. No, no, have pity, she cried. Call down your dreadful fate on my head if you will, but do not harm this innocent child. At this mournful appeal, there was hardly one of the guests who could keep from tears, but the old crone only mumbled to herself as though she were uttering a spell. Then the king leapt to his feet, his hand at the jeweled hilt of the dagger that hung at his girdle. In another moment he might have stretched the wicked creature lifeless at his feet, but before he could draw the weapon from its sheath, another voice arrested him. Stay your hand, O king, lest even worse befall. No mortal may strike a fairy and go unpunished, and for the rest, take comfort, for your daughter shall not die. Then the 12th fairy stepped out from behind the arras where she had been hidden. My gift is still to come, she continued. As far as I can, I will undo the mischief which my sister has done. It is true that I have not the power to prevent altogether what she has decreed. The princess shall indeed prick her finger with the spindle of the spinning wheel on the day when she attains her 15th year. But instead of dying, she shall fall into a deep sleep, and this sleep shall last for 100 years, and when the time is past, a king's son shall come to waken her. Whoop, I touched something. There we go. What's that? Put that over here. Yeah. And there we go. So here's the evil 13th fairy,
Foiled again.
as she's, angrily storming away, perhaps. All right. We are on to chapter 5, and I just kind of want to touch bases with everyone, remind you, please take care of yourselves. Hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is you need to do to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. I appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out, my lovely Librophiles, and listening to this story. I mean, it's a bit childish, perhaps, but it's still a classic. And, you know, sometimes the classics are sweet, and some of them are quite dark, and some of them are just quite silly. So, that being said, yep, okay. Grab, put that over there. I can find it later. We are on to chapter 5. So the worst was averted, but the fate of the poor little princess was still terrible enough, and it was only to be expected that the king should do his best to prevent the prophecy from coming to fulfillment. The first thing he did was to summon all the magicians of his own and neighboring countries, promising a rich reward to one who could show him a way to defeat the old fairy's malice. The magicians came in scores, some with long beards reaching to their feet, some without any beards at all, some with bald heads, and some with matted hair that looked as though it had not been combed for centuries. For days there were so many magicians about the palace that they were commoner than cats, and it was impossible to enter any room without surprising one or the other of them sitting in deep reflection and looking as wise as only a magician can look. But nothing came of their thinking, and one after the other they gave up the task and departed, having first asked for their traveling expenses. At last there came a wizard who was wiser and more venerable than all the rest. And when he heard that what was required of him, he said he would go home and consult his secret books, which contained the magic lore of all the ages, and which had been written by the greatest of all magicians, Merlin himself. Home then he went, to his cell, which was in a rocky cliff on the side of a mountain, and having uttered the word of power which unlocked the massive door, he entered, and prepared to begin his researches. Now, the books of magic lore which Merlin had written were in many volumes, and everything in them was set down in alphabetical order, so that it couldn't be found easily. The old wizard therefore turned first of all to the word princess. 500 pages were devoted to this subject, and truly there was a great deal of interesting information, as thus: Princess, how to transform Goose Girl into. Spell for causing princess to be surrounded with high walls of bronze, which may by no means be broken down except by the notes of a certain trumpet. GV. Now, GV are the first letters of two magic words which are to be found in all dictionaries and encyclopedias on to this day. Princess, enchanted ring for. A new and improved method by which she may be changed into a fawn together with any member of her family according to to desire, and all of them transformed back again into their proper shape. Princess. An excellent device for causing a princess to grow tall or short by eating of a mushroom, with directions how to find the place where the mushroom grows, and precautions to be taken lest by overmuch nibbling she disappear altogether. And so on. But there was never a word about how to prevent a princess from falling into a charmed sleep through pricking her finger with the spindle of a spinning wheel. So, when he had read all through the 500 pages, the venerable wizard turned to the word sleep, in the hope that he would meet the better fortune. And there was much reliable information under this heading also. There were recipes for potent drugs which would cause sleep, and for still more potent drugs which would prevent people from going to sleep. And when the wizard came to the last, he cried out eagerly, for he thought that he had succeeded in his quest, until he read on and discovered that the spell described was only for use on wicked queens who had shamefully ill-used their stepchildren. It is very easy to make a mistake in magic, for it is a most complicated science. By the time he had read through the 200 pages devoted to the word sleep, the venerable wizard was very uneasy, but he was a persevering person, and he did not abandon his endeavors. Merlin's wise books having failed him, he cast about for other means to learn what he desired, and consulted his oracle. Mm. Mm-hmm. Now, his oracle was a stuffed crocodile hanging from the ceiling. Where's Sino when you need him? And a voice came from it, which told him to repeat the magic formula. The magic formula in a sentence made up of all the sounds that are left out of ordinary speech, and it is a fearsome thing to listen to. It is also very exhausting to say, and after the venerable wizard had repeated it, he was obliged to rest for several hours. Then he rose again and drew pentagons on the rocky floor of his cave, and crossed the triangles and circles bordered with all the signs of the zodiac, and he stood in the middle of the pentagons and the crossed triangles and the circles and went through all sorts of strange and secret rites, but all to no purpose. But still, he would not give up trying, and he went to mysterious places in the woods, and gathered strange herbs in the dark of the moon, and returning home, he cast the herbs into a brazier, and they burnt with flames of many colors, giving out clouds of dense smoke and a most horrible smell. Then, as these exercises did not bring him the result he desired, he gazed into crystals and poured ink into the palm of his hand, and did all the other things that he had learnt to do in all the years since he was apprenticed to magic as a very small boy. And just as he was going to give up the quest in despair, a thought came into his head.
A thought!
And he cried aloud for joy, for he knew he had discovered what he sought. This shows how even the most difficult things may be attained by perseverance and patience. At the top of his speed, he hastened back to the palace and asked an audience with the king. This was immediately granted, for, to tell the truth, the king was awaiting his return with considerable anxiety. "Well," said he, "have you succeeded in finding a way?" "I have," answered the venerable wizard. "My arts have not failed me." And he handed the king a piece of parchment on which were written the following words. They were in Latin to make them look more important, but very likely it was not good Latin, for the venerable wizard had been apprenticed to his trade at an early age, and, in consequence, his classical education had been somewhat neglected. But this was the meaning of them. I'm going to open that in another... Shall spindle prick, then spindle burn, no thread weave and no wheel turn. If there's no spindle and there's no wheel, then no finger the spindle can feel. I think I'm gonna read that again. I like that. Shall spindle prick, then spindle burn, no thread weave and no wheel turn. If there's no spindle and there's no wheel, then no finger the spindle can feel. That's a good poem, or I guess, a couplet? No, quatrain, maybe? I think.
Drink water. Become
Yes, Prince Frey,
moist.
you got it. I will. I'll stay hydrated. Mm-hmm. Ah, okay. The king slapped his thigh for joy. I am Faye. It has been a very busy workday, but I am quite good, thank you. I literally had meetings at 12 and at 1 today. I was like, oh, this is going to cut right up to when I have to start streaming. So, busy, busy. The king slapped his thigh for joy. Why, of course, said he. How is it that I did not myself think of such a simple solution? It seems to me, wizard, that you have easily earned your 1,000 crowns. Ah, Majesty, the wizard made answer, all things are simple when once you know them. And in this he was quite right. I agree. Meetings indeed should be banned, most of which can be handled via an email. And I loved that this quote exploratory meeting of um, us discussing the electronic visit verification, which means nothing to most people, but it is a process that was rolled out by the federal government for caregivers to have proof of actually entering and exiting the home. Is it a good idea? Absolutely. Was the execution very, very poor? 100%. But I digress. Yes, it was a very boring meeting in which we scheduled a future meeting where we'll be discussing it more at length rather than discussing the details of roughly what it is that they hope to do. We'll actually discuss what we would like to be doing next time. uh, yeah. Okay. So here we have this very, very happy wizard. He's like, yeah, I've got this quatrain. Check it out. That's in my head canon. My goodness. Okay, let's see. We're on to chapter 6. Okay. Right? Yeah, this is 10 out of 10 wizard pose. He's just like, hey man, he's giving hippie, like, I chill out in the woods and smoke a little grass while I go look for my herbs, you know? He's given the vibe. It's a vibe. Oh, let's see. Chapter 6. My herbs! Oh man. Chapter 6. The king lost no time in putting the wizard's counsel into effect. The very next day, he caused a proclamation to be written and ordered copies of it to be fixed on all the church doors and in all the public places of every town in his kingdom. This is the way the proclamation read. Whereas a certain malicious fairy, forgetful of the duties she owes to the most high and puissant king and queen, rightful sovereigns of these realms, and to the Princess Briar Rose, their dearly loved daughter, has, of malice aforethought, and with intent to work grievous bodily harm to the person of the said princess, and in the presence of the said most puissant sovereigns, and of divers of their
loyal subjects made and uttered a prophecy, to wit, that the said princess shall in her 15th year prick her finger with the spindle of a spinning wheel, and that a certain dire misfortune shall fall upon her because of that injury. To the sorrow of her loving parents, now be it decreed that all spinning wheels or instruments of spinning whatsoever in the possession of any subject of the king's most excellent majesty, whether they be worked by hand or by treadle or by any other device, together with all spindles, shuttles, bobbins, and all other accessories of appurtenances thereunto belonging, shall forthwith be rendered up to the officers of the king's most excellent majesty appointed to receive them. And be it further decreed, that if any person or persons fail to observe or obey this edict or ordinance by unlawfully retaining any instrument of spinning or accessory thereunto, such person shall be dealt with according to the full rigour of the law, and shall suffer the penalty of death, given under our royal hand and seal.
I would like to point out that this decree, very wordy, and to the general masses, of which I'm going to say at least 60% of them cannot read, bless. I imagine the priest or church officials, all of them would be able to read most likely, and would have to explain this to the general populace. But like the casual washerwoman on the street probably walked by as like, that's a lot of words. I can't read any of that. Something something decreed. I don't know. Ah, silly. The issue of the proclamation caused a great deal of interest and excitement throughout the kingdom. All the people came out of their homes to gaze at it, for they had never seen its like before, and though very few of them knew how to read, they realized that it must mean something very important. See? What did I tell you? Hmm. Mm-hmm. They know it's important, no idea what it says. So they sent for clerks and scholars to read it to them, paying a penny apiece for the service, which pennies the clerks and scholars, being usually extraordinarily needy persons, were very glad to earn. It usually took about 3 hours to read the proclamation and to explain it, and one must admit that it might have been expressed in fewer words. Really? You don't say? To do so, however, would not have been dignified, for this proclamation was what is called a legal instrument. The very next day, into each town and village of the kingdom, the king's officers came riding. Before them went a trumpeter who stopped at the head of each street and blew a loud call. "Dur-dur-dur!" Having thus commanded attention, he marched past the houses, calling in a loud voice,
Bring out your spinning wheels! Bring out your spinning wheels! Bring out your dead!
Sorry. So the people brought them out, not without grumbling, for a spinning wheel is a very useful thing to have in a house. And in those days people spun and wove their own cloth to make their clothes. But they were afraid to disobey the king's order. I'll say it's penalty of death. I would be scared too. And the spinning wheels were of all shapes and sizes, some of them new, some of them hundreds of years old, and there was hardly a house that did not possess one of some kind or another. They were all collected together and loaded into wagons and taken to the capital, where they were piled up into an immense heap in the public square. Then the king and queen and all the court came out and watched while the big heap was set on fire. I would just like to point out that this is a newborn baby, and they have 15 years. Mind you, 15 years in which to wait. So it's not until her 15th birthday that this is an issue. So let her live her life, let her see spindles, let her understand what they are. I mean, just, it's like, hey, on your 14th birthday or before your 15th birthday, we're going to burn them all and we want you to avoid them. Children are naturally curious. I don't know. Like, I would have waited. I would have waited. Then the king and queen and all the court came out and watched while the big heap was set on fire. The people came out to watch too in their thousands, and a very fine sight it was to see the enormous flames shooting up into the air and to hear the crackle and hiss of the burning wood that sounded like a discharge of 100 muskets. Yeah, education usually is. That's probably why there was, so many people ignorant. They didn't focus on education. The king laughed aloud in his relief, and even the queen smiled while the little princess, Briar Rose, who was held up to a window of the palace to see the bonfire, that's not weird, stretched out her arms to the pretty flames and crowed. But the people were not very much amused by the sight because they were their spinning wheels which were being burnt. "I've had my wheel for 20 years," said one woman, "and now I've none at all, and how on earth can I get along without it, I don't know, for 6 growing lads to find breeches for." Valid. Ooh, there's the bonfire. It almost looks like people are dancing in the street, but they're probably just like, my spinning wheel. 5 silver crowns my wheel cost my good man last Candlemas, said another, and there it goes up in flames and smoke. What is a wheel if the burning of it saves our little princess? Quoth a third. I got to say quoth, unironically, in anything other than Edgar Allan Poe. I am tickled pink. Come, cheer up, mother. The king has reason for what he does, and he will not see us want. And this man was right. The king had no wish to oppress his subjects, for no sooner was the pile reduced to ashes than he caused another proclamation to be issued, saying that the owner of every spinning wheel should be paid for its loss. And not only so, but the king told his merchants to buy spun yarn from neighboring countries so that the people might be able to weave even though they could not spin. I mean, is it an ideal solution? Probably not, but um, it's something. All right, we're about halfway through the book at this point at chapter 7. Just kind of want to touch bases with everybody, so see how everyone's doing. Hope you're hydrating, caffeinating, snacking, doing whatever it is you need to do to feel relaxed and enjoy the story. Give me a second here. We did 3 ads before we got started today, so I'm pretty confident that we can, quote unquote, get by without having to do any ads for the rest of the stream, which I feel would be ideal. Just kind of keep an eye on things and see who's who and what's what, and we'll be able to find somebody to pop into. Maybe I should get a like a wise crocodile text to speech that drops down as like, "Oh great crocodile of the sky, please tell us your secrets." You know, it would be really funny. It's just picturing that wizard as like his, his I don't know, his minion, his sage crocodile of the sky. It's just funny to imagine. Okay. I am so squirrely. I'm so sorry, everyone. You're just, you have to tolerate my weirdness. Ah, okay. I want my. Oop, there we go. Chapter 7. Hmm. Okay, let's see. Chapter 7. Helps if I click on the right thing. There's the right button. There we are. The little Princess Briar Rose, of course, knew nothing of the strange events that had happened at the feast of her christening. No good can come of this. And the king gave orders that nobody should even mention the subject to her. It is not a pleasant thing to know that the fairies have decreed that one shall fall asleep for 100 years on one's 15th birthday, even though one is to be awakened by a handsome prince at the end of that time. So all the lords in waiting and the ladies in waiting had to be very careful and discreet. If they told the princess a story, they had to keep the word spinning out of it. And if they showed her a book, they had to take pains to see it did not contain a picture of a spinning wheel, or any reference to a distaff or spindle, lest she should ask what they were. The king's customs officers on the boundaries of the kingdom had to examine every wagon load of merchandise that came into the country, for fear it should contain a spinning wheel. And if anybody was found trying to smuggle one in, he was brought before the judges and punished. By these devices, the king felt certain that he had averted the fate laid upon his daughter. He's getting complacent. But the promises of the other wise women were fulfilled, and fulfilled to the letter, for the young princess grew up to be the most beautiful, gifted, and gracious maiden in all the world. That, at any rate, was what everybody in the palace said, from the lords and ladies down to the scullions in the kitchen. And although people are inclined sometimes to flatter royalty, in this case, there was reason for their admiration. To begin with, the princess was as lovely as a spring morning, with eyes of the purest, softest blue, and hair in which the rays of the sun seemed to be entangled. When she came into a room, people stopped whatever they were doing to look at her, and everyone felt happier because she was there. And her cleverness. She never had any trouble with her letters or her multiplication table. She could cipher as easily as she could spell. She knew the history of her own country and of every country round it, and nobody could puzzle her with the hardest question in geography. She could sew and embroider and knit and paint and draw. She could repeat poetry in 5 different languages. She studied mathematics and botany and astronomy and even law. In short, there was no end to her knowledge, and all because she had those fairies for her godmothers. Besides this, there were all her other accomplishments. She could play on all sorts of musical instruments, as for instance, fiddle and zither, large harp and Jew's harp, church organ and mouth organ. Oh my, she could play the mouth organ. My goodness. Church organ and mouth organ, and I expect a bonk. If you won't give me one, I will give one to myself. I deserve it. Bonk. Yes. Yeah, I know. They said it, okay? Large harp and Jew's harp, church organ and mouth organ, flute and penny whistle, and even on the nursery comb. She could sing like a nightingale and dance like a fairy. There she is, dancing to someone else fiddling. Yeah, phrasing! Phrasing. Yeah. And yet she was never conceited or puffed up, as some good-looking and accomplished people are apt to be. On the contrary, she was always sweet-tempered and modest, and for this reason she was loved. People may admire good looks and a graceful deportment, and they may respect ability, but it is only sweetness of nature and goodness of heart that can win love, and these things were the gift of a third fairy. So, the years passed, and at last came the day when the Princess Briar Rose was 15 years of age. What a day that was! Everybody came to wish her many happy returns, and she had so many presents that at least a dozen servants were kept busy unwrapping the parcels. Side note, I recently learned that in Western countries, the opening and get a gift in front of the giver is very common practice, but I did not realize that in a lot of Eastern countries, it's considered rude, and vice versa. If if you're given a gift in Japan, I think also in China, I don't know 100%, definitely in Japan, if you're given a gift, you're seen as greedy if you open said gift right away. The polite thing to do would be to take that gift and set it aside out of respect. You know, it's like you're respecting their time, you're respecting the honor of the gift. It's an interesting dichotomy of customs. The king gave her a white pony with a saddle of red velvet, and a bridle and stirrups of gold, while the queen's present was a beautiful and costly necklace of pearls. Even the boy who turned the spit in the kitchen brought her something, and though it was only a little wooden shoe which he had carved with his own hands, the princess prized it just as much as though it had been made of gold. The only person who was not happy on the princess's birthday was the queen, and she went about with a pale face and a look of great anxiety. Come, come, my love, said the king, what is the matter with you? Surely you are not thinking of that foolish old prophecy. How can I help thinking about it? The queen answered. I have not been able to get it out of my mind for 15 years, and now that the day has come, I am afraid. Make your mind easy, said the king. Nothing is going to happen. Why, there's not a spinning wheel within 100 miles. I have taken good care of that. And he went away, chuckling, to attend a meeting of his cabinet, but the queen shook her head. Now, while the king and queen were talking, the Princess Briar Rose was wandering about in the castle, visiting room after room as she had done many times before. The castle was so big that a stranger might easily have been lost in its maze of stairways and corridors, but Briar Rose knew every part of it quite well. From the great kitchens below ground, where on feast days a score of cooks prepared the dinner for hundreds of guests, to the topmost turret above the battlements where the sentries kept watch with their pikes on their shoulders. There was only one part of the castle which Briar Rose had never explored, and that was an ancient tower which rose from the eastern end. The door of that tower was always locked, and the king, the queen sobbing, the king like, "Hey, I gotta go," with his thumb. Go to his meeting, the cooks, the stable hand, the jester, all of, some kind of, I guess, noble woman brushing her hair, various people sweeping the council, all kinds of action happening. And then over on the far right, the princess going over to the eastern turret, going up and up when it was a previously locked door. Locked. And although the princess had often tried to find the key, she had never succeeded. The servants told her that the tower had not been inhabited for nearly 100 years, and it had never been entered within the memory of anybody in the castle. Today, Briar Rose flitted restlessly from place to place. She peeped into the kitchen and saw the kitchen boys turning the spits on which whole oxen were being roasted. Then she went on to the empty throne room and saw the golden thrones side by side upon the dais, and the rich tapestry, glowing with all the colors of the rainbow on the walls. After that she mounted to the battlements, from which she could see over miles and miles of her father's kingdom, and not content with that, she ran up the staircases into the turrets, and looked through their narrow slits of windows upon the courtyard below, so far down that the people walking therein seemed no bigger than mice. And then she came down again and continued her wanderings, searching in all sorts of out-of-the-way corners, until at last she found herself before the door of the ancient tower, into which she had never been. And as she looked at the door, she gave a start of surprise and then a cry of joy. There was a key in the lock. Dun dun dun. Oh, that's ominous. We got bats and an owl come flying out of the door once it's opened. My goodness. Okay, what are we on about here? All right. So we are looking at chapter 8, and I'm going to give myself a good stretch. Ooh. All of the pops and crackles. Ignore the pops and crackling. I'm old. I'm very old. Not actually old. We are on to chapter 8. Let's see. Chapter 8. Quick sip. A little hydration, if you will. I think one of the things that I would like to get, maybe in this next year, is I'd like an opening, a transition, a be right back, and a closing, like a ending stream and an offline stream of like some kind of book opening or a book flipping through pages and like zooming in on like a castle, something along that like. So I'll have to either one, learn how to animate, or two, find somebody that has some idea of what I'm talking about. I digress. Let's get into the meat potatoes of chapter 8. It was a rusty key, and Briar Rose was afraid that she might not be able to turn it, but to her surprise it turned quite easily.
Almost like magic.
The heavy door swung inward on its ancient hinges with many a creak and groan, and she found herself in a little dark room, thickly carpeted with the dust of years. Gross. But from this room a winding staircase led upward, and Briar Rose was just about to climb the stair when a sudden noise made her start back in alarm. Whirr! I don't know why that wouldn't be. It's probably more of a sound. There was a beating of wings, a flurry, and a scuffle, and past her face flew a dark shape with gleaming yellow eyes. Silly princess! Owls have silent wings. It was only an owl who was hiding in the tower out of the sunlight. But he gave poor Briar Rose a great fright, and she was in two minds whether to turn back or not. But the winding staircase looked very inviting, and she wanted to see whither it led. So gathering up her skirts to avoid any creepy things that might be crawling about, she ran up the stairway as fast as she could, round and round until she reached the top. There she came upon another door. In this door also was a rusty key, and Briar Rose turned it as easily as she had turned the first. Then she pushed open the door and entered. she found herself in a small room lighted by narrow windows. Beneath one of these windows was a couch, and in front of it sat an old woman with a spinning wheel. "Good morrow, motherkin," said the princess. "What are you doing?"
I am spinning, my pretty child,
answered the old woman without ceasing her work. "Spinning?" asked the princess. "Oh, do let me see. What is that thing which goes round so merrily?"
That is the spinning wheel,
said the old woman.
Why, child, you speak as though you have never seen such a thing before.
"Indeed, I have not," said the princess. "How interesting it is. I wonder whether I could do it as well as you. Will you let me try?"
Why, of course, said the old woman. Every young girl should know how to spin. Here you are, my dear.
And she gave Briar Rose the spindle. Now, whether the princess, in her eagerness to seize the spindle, grasped it too roughly, or whether it was just because the fairy had ordained that it should be so, I do not know. But anyhow, the sharp iron point pricked her hand, and immediately she fell backward on to the couch in a deep sleep. And in that very moment, sleep fell upon every man, woman, and child in the castle, and upon every living thing within its gates. The king, who was sitting at the council board with his ministers, stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence, and remained with his mouth open in the act of uttering a word, and nobody remarked the strangeness of his conduct, for all his ministers were asleep too, just as they sat. Outside the door, the sentry leaned upon his pike. In the queen's chamber, the ladies in waiting fell into a profound slumber, in the very midst of what they were doing. One as she was hemming a handkerchief, another over her embroidery, still another while she was talking to her parrot. The queen slept in her chair, and a little page boy who was singing fell asleep in the middle of a note. All through the castle the charmed slumber spread. Courtiers, officers, stewards, cooks, errand boys, soldiers, beadles, nay, the very horses in the stables and the dogs in their kennels were stricken, motionless as though they were dead. The flies ceased to buzz at the windows and the pigeons to coo upon the roof. In the great kitchen the scullions fell asleep as they were washing up the dishes, and a cook in the very act of boxing the ears of a kitchen knave. But not for 100 years would he feel that blow, or be able to utter the cry that was on the tip of his tongue. The dog fell asleep under the table as he was gnawing a bone, the cat in front of a mouse hole, the mouse itself on the other side of the skirting board, with a little sharp nose outstretched to sniff the air suspiciously. Even the spits which were turning at the fire, laden with partridges and pheasants, cooking for the princess's birthday feast, even they ceased to turn, and the very fire stopped flickering, and the flames sank down. A deep silence fell over the castle. In the fields the lambs ceased to bleat, the horses to neigh, and the cows to low. The birds in the trees were silent. One moment the air was full of the music of their twittering, the next, all was still as in a desert. The very wind dropped to sleep in the woods. Not a leaf stirred, and the white clouds were motionless in the sky. So, sleep fell upon the enchanted castle, and upon all within, because of the Princess Briar Rose, who lay there on her couch in the ancient tower, waiting till the 100 years should be past, and the prince should come to waken her. And all round the castle there grew up a hedge of thorn, tangled with ivy, woodbine, and creeping plants, so dense that from a distance it seemed like a little wood. Higher and higher it grew, closing round the castle like a wall, until all that could be seen was the top of the highest tower and the flagstaff from which the royal standard hung limp and motionless. And the years went by. each with its changing seasons. Spring came and brought to the fields and woods outside the new life of leaf and flower. The trees awoke from their winter sleep and clothed themselves gloriously in green. The birds began to sing again, and the swallows and martins built their nests under the eaves. Children laughed and clapped their hands because they were happy in the bright sunshine, and old people felt their hearts filled with joy when they saw the mist of bluebells in the woods and the daffodils dancing in the breeze. But within the thorn hedge no life stirred, and neither flower nor tree answered the call of spring. As time went on, the people who were young when the palace was enchanted grew old and died. But they never forgot the prophecy that one of these days the sleeping princess should awaken, and they told the story to their children, who told it in their turn, changing it a little because it was only a tale to them. And so, after many years, the legend spread abroad to neighboring countries, and many a young prince dreamed that it was he who was destined to break the spell and waken the sleeping princess. Now and again, one would take the quest upon him and try to force his way through the thick hedge, but no one succeeded. The sharp thorns gripped the unhappy young men like clutching hands and held them fast, so that they could neither go forward nor back, and they perished miserably. Their bones, whitened by the sun and wind, remained there as a warning for all to see, and the creeping plants grew over them. That was dark. All right. We're on to chapter 9. Take a little hydration break. Bear with me. Chapter 9. 100 years passed by. At the end of that time, it happened one day that a young prince who was hunting in the neighborhood caught sight of the towers of the enchanted castle rising above the dense forest. He had never been in that part of the country before and had heard nothing of the story of the sleeping princess. So he asked the first people he met, what those towers were and to whom the castle belonged. Everybody told him a different tale. One said that it was an old castle haunted by spirits. Another, that it was a meeting place for all the witches and sorcerers in the land, who gathered there to practice their secret rites. No, no, said a third. That castle is the home of a giant, and all the people in these parts are very much afraid of him. So I have been told, because he steals their cattle and their crops, and he even carries off their children to be his servants, and they cannot go to the rescue of those he has imprisoned in this way, because of the forest all round the castle, which is so dense that nobody can force his way through. And so they went on, one saying one thing, and one another, for each repeated what he had heard. At last an old peasant stepped forward.
50 years ago, my prince, said he, my father told me the story of that castle, and since he was born in these parts, I think it was the true story, and I will tell it to you if you would like to hear it.
The prince nodded eagerly, and the old man went on.
My father said that years before he himself was born, a king and a queen lived in the castle with their daughter, the most beautiful princess that ever was seen. In some way or other they angered the fairies, who put a spell upon the place, and upon everyone within it, so that they fell into a deep sleep. My father said that this sleep would last 100 years, but at the end of that time a king's son should come and waken the beautiful princess and make her his bride.
When the young prince heard these words, he felt his heart beat quickly. Something seemed to tell him that he and no other was the king's son who was destined to remove the spell, and he cried, "Show me the way to the castle, for I will take this adventure upon me." Tally-ho. But the old man shook his head.
I have not yet told you all, my prince. Many are the young men who have tried to force their way through the thick wood that guards the enchanted castle. Each of them thought that he and he alone was destined to awaken the sleeping beauty, and each of them set out with high hopes. But none of them all came back, and their bones, whitened by the wind and rain, lie among the thorns of the thick.
And here we have the king's son and the old man and the dog. Why not? Let's see.
Lie among the thorns of the thick. Hedge a fearful warning to the venturesome. I pray you, therefore, my prince, to do nothing rash, but think well before you take upon yourself this perilous quest.
What? Cried the prince with flashing eyes. Shall I hold back when others have dared? This very hour I will attempt to enter the castle, and if I do not return, carry home the news of how I have died. Bold. Then, without paying any heed to the words of those who would prevent him from rushing into such danger, the eager young man set out, his heart on fire with thoughts of love and glory. Nobody showed him the way, but he could see the towers of the castle rising above the distant wood, and when he entered the wood itself, and the towers were hidden, each path he took led him nearer to the place where he would be. At last, he came to an open glade, and there before him was a tangled hedge of thorn, stretching in either direction as far as the eye could see. Oh, that's cool. Here is our young king's son in the red, and then we have the various bones and shields and the bodies of those that came before, and a knight on the far right. That's cool. So he's like, I'm gonna fuck around and find out and tell my dad how I died. It's okay. Ah, we are on to chapter 10. Bear with me a second. I think we're like in the last 2 or 3 chapters. And now, as the prince. And now, as the prince drew nearer, he could see that the story he had heard about the terrible place was true. For held in the tangle. There we go. Stretch my shoulder. There we go. For held in the tangle of briar were the bones of many unhappy young men who had tried to force their way through to the castle. Rags and tatters of their finery hung upon the great thorns that pointed menacingly like sharp claws. Here and there upon the ground beneath lay pieces of rusty armor, a helmet surrounded by a coronet of gold that once had belonged to a king's son, a shield with a prince's device, a sword with jewel-encrusted hilt worth a king's ransom. There they lay, all disregarded among the blanched bones upon the grass, and the ground ivy spread out its leaves to cover them. Not a sound broke the deep and awful silence. No bird sang, no insect droned, there was no scurry of woodland creatures among the leaves. No sigh of wind in the trees, and all that place only the thorn hedge seemed threateningly alive, waiting to destroy the intruder who should attempt to force the secret it guarded. Who would blame the prince if for a moment his heart had almost failed him? There was no gap in that hedge, and the great thorns were sharp as dagger blades to stab his flesh. But if the prince hesitated, it was not for long. Have I come so far to turn back now? He thought. These others who have died were brave men, and though they failed, with a courage as great as theirs, I may succeed. And without wasting another moment, the prince began to force his way through the hedge. And now, he noticed with surprise that those thorns which looked so sharp and cruel became soft as thistledown as soon as he touched them. Is he the one? And the trailing bramble branches did not entangle him, but bent aside as at his touch, as though they had been stems of grass. The hedge opened before him, and as he went through it, pink blossoms of wild roses bloomed on the branches, until the tangled wall became a mass of flowers. At last the prince found himself on the other side of the hedge in the gardens of the castle. Before him he could see the high towers and turrets, bathed in the fresh light of the morning sun, and as he hastened towards them, he noticed that the gardens were as trim and tidy as though they had just been tended by the gardeners. There was no moss or weed upon the smooth paths. The turf on the lawns was as short and firm as though it had just been mown, and in the flower beds everything was in the most careful order. Spring flowers were blooming there, but they bowed their heads upon their stalks, and even the trees seemed to hang their arms as though asleep. Everywhere there was the same deep silence. The air, which should have been full of the twittering of birds, was heavy and languorous. There was no flutter of butterfly wings or darting of flies. The fountains on the lawns were not playing, and as the prince glanced over the edge of the marble basin of one of them, he could see the goldfish beneath the water lily leaves lying still, with never a wave of the tail or flicker of fin. So he's looking in the pond there. You can kind of see some fish down in the pond. So you see these lilies and then the fish there that are just sitting there, chilling. Fascinating. Everything went to sleep. I like that idea. Of the marble basin of one of them, he could see the goldfish beneath the water lily leaves, lying still, with never a wave of the tail or flicker of fin. So he went on over the lawns and terraces, and never a waking thing did he see. But when he came to the courtyard, he saw a soldier standing there, leaning on his pike, with his head bent upon his chest. At first, the prince thought that he was dead, but his cheek was fresh and ruddy, and it was quite plain to see that he was merely asleep. In the courtyard itself were other human forms, all still and silent. A row of pikemen leaned against the wall, and in front of them, stretched out upon the ground, snored the sergeant, who had been drilling them when the spell came upon the castle. A young squire, with a sleeping hawk upon his wrist, slept leaning against a sleeping horse, which he had been about to mount. Near by lay a page with a hound in leash, both sleeping as soundly as though they never would awake. And through a window in the stables, the prince saw a groom lying with a straw in his mouth. In the stables themselves, a like condition of things prevailed. The horses slept at their stalls with their noses in the mangers, standing on their 4 legs, just as they were when they were enchanted 100 years before, and on the back of one of them sat the stable cat. Here and there upon the ground lay grooms and ostlers, fast asleep among the straw. From the stable the prince made his way to the great kitchen, where he saw equally strange sights, and he could not help smiling when he came upon the cook, with her hand still outstretched to clout the head of the unhappy scullion, whom she had by the ear. Before the fires hung the spitted partridges and fowls that were cooking for the princess's birthday feast, and at the table a maid had fallen asleep with her hands in a large trough full of dough. She had been making the pastry for a pie when the sleep fell upon her, and by her side was another maid, who had been plucking a black hen. At the sink kitchen knave was leaning over the pot he had been scouring. Then the prince went out into the great hall and saw the courtiers asleep in the window alcoves or stretched out upon the polished floor. Everywhere was a silence so profound that the prince was almost alarmed to hear his own breathing, and the beating of his heart sounded like a muffled drum. On and on he went, through rooms and corridors, up staircases and down staircases, into the queen's chamber where he saw the queen and her ladies as still and silent as the rest. One of those ladies had been reading to the queen at the moment when the charmed sleep fell upon the castle, and the book, a history of Troy, still lay open on her lap. Then the prince went into the king's room, where his majesty sat with his ministers of state round the council board. He almost lingered there, for it was very curious to see those nobles as quiet and motionless as though they had been waxworks in a show. Some of them were frowning as though in deep thought, and some smiling as though they had suddenly remembered something clever to say. The king himself, at the head of the council table, had evidently fallen asleep in the very midst of a speech, for his arm lay outstretched on the table, with a pointing finger, and by his side his secretary's fingers still held the pen with which he was inscribing on a roll of parchment the royal words. So the prince hurried through the castle from top to bottom until he had glanced into every room and opened every door. And still he knew that there was something more to see, for nowhere had he come across the sleeping princess. Many maidens he had seen of surpassing beauty, but his heart told him that none of them all was the maiden whom he had come to awaken. Down he went into the courtyard again, and found another stairway which led to the battlements. There stood the watchman, whose duty it was to look out over the country and report the arrivals of travelers. But they too were all asleep, though one of them had his horn in his hand as though he had been about to blow it, when he was suddenly overcome by the charmed slumber. From the battlements the prince climbed, in turn, into each of the turrets, but there was nobody in them at all, and no living thing except the owls asleep in the crevices of the walls, and the bats that hung head downward from the rafters. Now only one small turret remained to be explored. It was the oldest of the turrets, almost a ruin, and plainly long unused, for the iron door was rusty and the ivy trailed about the walls. The prince approached it with a beating heart, for there he knew he would find what he sought. He threw open the creaking door. With impatient feet he mounted the crazy, winding stair, opened the door at the top, and entered a little dark room. And then he started forward with a cry of joy and wonder, for lying on the couch below the narrow window, he saw the princess. She was lying upon a couch with her lovely hair spread out like a stream of gold, and oh, no words can tell how beautiful she was. Softly the prince came near and bent over her. He touched her hand. It was warm as in life, but she did not stir. No sound of breathing came from her parted lips. Fresh and sweet as the petals of a rose, her eyes were closed. For a long time the prince stood and gazed upon her, for never in all his life had he seen a maiden so lovely. Then suddenly he bent down and kissed her lips. That was the end of the enchantment. The princess's eyelids quivered. Languidly she moved her head and stretched out her arms. Her eyes opened and she smiled. "It is you, my prince." "Is it you, my prince?" she said. "How long you have kept me waiting." "I imagine it was 100 years," So this is why education is important. We are down to I think this is the last chapter here. Bear with me. Ba, 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 da, ba. Yep, that's the last chapter. Okay, so chapter ba, 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 da, ba. Whoop. Chapter 11 is the final chapter. We've done really, really good today. I can read this last chapter. We can have a little, just chatting afterwards. And then we can find somebody to go visit. I'm not sure who all's um, online right now, but we'll find somebody. We are chapter 11. There we go. In that very moment, the charm was broken and the castle awoke. Instead of the profound silence, there came a hustle and confusion of noise. Clocks began to strike, doors began to slam, dogs began to bark, cocks began to crow, and hens to cluck. A breeze sprang up outside and set the branches of the trees swaying and creaking. The doves began to coo upon the roofs. The swallows to twitter under the eaves, flies came out and buzzed out about the window, mice squeaked in the wainscot, and ran scampering along the rafters. The fountain in the garden leapt up 60 feet into the air, and the goldfish swam among the water lily leaves. Ants left their nests and foraged about the paths. The butterflies danced and fluttered over the flowers, which lifted their heads as though to drink in the rays of the sun. In every tree in the garden, a thrush woke up and began to sing. Sparrows chirped, jays screamed, blue tits chattered, and the chiff-chaff uttered his strange note. In the woods, a cuckoo called and a blackbird fluted to blackbird in the hedge. In the stables, the horses awoke and champed at their stalls. The cat jumped down and ran after a mouse, which crept out from under the straw. The sentry at the courtyard gate woke up and rubbed his eyes and came smartly to attention, looking round uneasily, for he thought he had only been asleep for a few minutes, and was afraid that somebody might have seen him who would report him to the sergeant. The pikemen also woke with a start, and the sergeant woke too, and bellowed an order in a loud and angry voice, for he was ashamed of himself for sleeping in front of his men. Relax, bro. It's not like you had any choice in the matter. The young squire who was going hawking fitted his falcon hood and mounted his steed. The page boy with the hound went off to his master. On the topmost tower of the castle, the royal standard, which had been drooping against the flagstaff, filled out and waved freely in the breeze. The hedge, which had grown up to surround the enchanted castle, broke in and disappeared. Peacocks squalled and strutted on the lawns. Martins flitted to and from their nests upon the eaves. Pigs began to grunt, oxen to low, sheep to bleat, rooks to caw, and children to laugh and sing. In short, all the sounds which we hear every day and all the time and never notice began again, and seemed so loud in contrast to the deadly silence that they almost cracked the ears. One might say, or conjecture to say, a cacophony of sound. And in every room in the castle, the people who had been lying asleep for 100 years woke up and went on with what they had been doing just as though nothing had happened. In the kitchen, the flames of the fire leapt up with a hiss and a roar, and the kettle began to boil, the stew pot to bubble, and the meat before the fire to steam and hiss as the little boy turned the spit. "Take that!" cried the cook, giving the scullion the clout she had promised 100 years before. "Take that for a lazy knave!" "Goodness!" yawned the maid who had been plucking the black hen. "I wonder what made me drop off to sleep like that. Well, well, it's to be hoped the cook didn't see me. And my word, how she made the feathers fly. Meow, cried the cat in disgust as he made a pounce at the mouse hole he had been watching. For the little mouse, pause for a second, beautiful artwork again. I I'm not sure how I feel about some of these leg shapes. They're kind of like these two men sitting on the floor here kind of have some weird shape, and he's got kind of bowed legs. No, I guess that would be knock-kneed legs. The cat's like yowling, "My mouse!" Everybody's waking up and falling out. Oh my goodness. For the little mouse, who had poked his nose out 100 years before, drew it back like a flash, and scampered away. "Dear me," said the servant who was washing the dishes. "I do believe I've been to sleep with this crock in my hand. It's a mercy I didn't let it fall." And he went on with his scouring. It was the same thing in the dairy, where the maids had fallen asleep while they were skimming the cream and churning the butter, and the cream was not sour for all that 100 years had passed. Nor was the butter rank. But a fly, which had been sleeping on the edge of one of the milk pans, woke up and flew down to taste the milk, and fell in and was drowned. So he was none the better because the spell had been taken off the castle. I would almost feel bad for the fly, but I honestly just feel bad for the milkmaids. In the queen's antechamber, the maids of honor and the ladies in wedding, bleh, and ladies in waiting sat up and yawned and stretched themselves.
Yeah, like that. Just like that.
Big pops. Ooh. Each one of them thought that she was the only one who had fallen asleep, and they all began to explain at the same time that they had only closed their eyes for 40 seconds. It was the heat, they all said to each other. The sun is very hot for this time of year. In the king's council chamber, the king and all his ministers woke up with a start. The ministers rubbed their eyes and looked very sheepish, for each of them thought that he was alone in being caught napping. "Your Majesty was saying," said the Prime Minister, respectfully leaning forward. "I was saying," said the king. "What was I saying?" And he stretched out his arms and yawned. "I crave your pardon, my lords. I do believe I've been asleep. Hey ho, but my joints are stiff." "It was but an after-dinner nap." It was but an after-dinner nap," said the Prime Minister. "Your Majesty is overspent with the hard hunting yesterday. It is your Majesty's will that we should proceed with our business, or shall the council rise until tomorrow?" "Go on, my lords, go on," cried the king heartily. "My little nap has wonderfully refreshed me. What say you? Shall we pass that bill we were discussing a few minutes ago?" But at this moment a page came into the room with a message from the queen, and as soon as he received it, the king left his seat in the council chamber and went to her, alone, among all the people in the castle. The queen had realized immediately. She woke from her charmed sleep exactly had realized immediately. She awoke from her charmed sleep exactly what had happened. The phrasing there is a bit odd. She remembered the words of the fairy godmother, and she knew that what she had foretold had come to pass, and that the sleep from which she and everybody else in the castle had just awakened had lasted 100 years. Her first thought was of her daughter, the Princess Briar Rose. Where was she? And what had happened to her? If she too had merely fallen asleep, all was well, but suppose the doom first spoken by the 13th fairy had taken effect? In a few words, she told the king In a few words, she had told the king all that was in her mind, and without delay messengers were sent all over the castle to look for the princess. "Hey, cat, welcome in." In the meantime, Briar Rose and the young prince were talking together in the ruined tower. For the first time she heard the story of the enchantment, and her eyes grew round with wonder as she listened to her lover's account. Totally just had a ADHD brain fart moment for a second there. Hold on. Okay. For the first time, she heard the story of the enchantment, and her eyes grew round with wonder as she listened to her lover's account of the strange things that had happened in the castle. When he told of the great hedge and its cruel thorns, and of the many young men who died in trying to force their way through it, her eyes filled with tears. How great their courage was, she sighed. Oh, if only I could bring them back to life. But the prince kissed her tears away and hastened past that part of his tale, and presently she was smiling again and happy, because she understood that everything had happened as it was bound to happen. Then the prince took her hand and raised her from the couch on which she had slept so long, and they went down the winding stair together, and came to the battlements, where they found a score of breathless people who had been running up and down in search of her. And how surprised these people were to find her in that place, accompanied by a young man they had never seen before. She seemed to have grown more beautiful than ever during her long sleep, and they were amazed by her loveliness. And how may we describe this joy of the king and queen when they saw their daughter again and knew that the good fairy had kept her word? The king was so delighted that all he could say was, "Bless my soul, bless my soul!" And the queen could say nothing at all, for she was weeping for joy. What a feast there was that night! In spite of the 100 years that had gone by, it was still the princess's birthday, and she was in reality no more than 15 years old, for time had stood still for her. So she had her birthday feast, just the same, and it was her betrothal feast too, for the king joined the hands of the young prince and his daughter and gave them his blessing. The end. Hmm. I like this little outro panel in the beginning and the start, at the beginning and the end of each of these books. It's really quite pretty. But yes, I'm a little whiffy about the whole being betrothed at 15, but maybe it's a long betrothal of 30 years. So, I mean, there's going to be, you have to tell the land and do another epic proclamation to people that don't know how to read, all of that jazz. Um, yes. I think this was a good story. I liked Charles Seddon Evans' versions. I liked they were softer, they were more palatable to the common modern day audience. They were whimsical, they were delightful, they were sweet. They had just a drop of danger. Yes, they're going to need a lot of spinning wheels. That is a whole kingdom without spinning wheels. Now, I have thought of this. So, what if it was just the capital, right? What if once the capital was surrounded by this hedge and it seemed like it was just the castle itself? What if the town surrounding the castle, the capital itself, had continued to grow and, people thereabouts had like moved away because who wants to live by a cursed castle? Um, Maybe they brought in more um, spinning wheels. It's like, well, it's already happened. What worse fate can there be? We can just bring them back in. I imagine people moved away, moved to the area. No one would want to live for like 100 miles around the cursed castle. Seemed like everything that was surrounded by the hedge was all asleep. So I don't know what that distance was, but it seemed like as soon as he passed through the hedge, he was in the gardens of the castle. So I don't think that would have been a very large diameter. So I don't know, something to contemplate. Um, Overall review. Um, both of these books were lovely, each in their own way. I think Arthur Rackham did a phenomenal job of illustrating both of these stories. I loved the multicolor silhouettes. I actually think I like the one silhouettes in Sleeping Beauty, the second book, better. Um, Particularly like the briar scene with the ivy and the briar clutching on the bodies of the deceased princes. It's just kind of a fascinating illustration, 2-page illustration. Either way, my takeaway from both of these is um, I think don't underestimate the importance of education. Um, be kind. You know, or the takeaway from Sleeping Beauty is the king forgot the 13th great fairy. I think Dimension 20 took reference from this one a lot more than others for her story intro. Her? Her story intro? So one of the characters. Oh, okay. One of the characters in the Dimension 20 campaign. I remember they did that campaign. I think I watched one episode where they did like the fables with Pinocchio and I think Sleeping Beauty and I do believe the cat, the Puss in Boots, and then there was I think one or two others. Yeah, mentioning all the dead princes filling the tower. Yeah. Did the bones disappear when the hedges disappeared? And I do think like if we really wanted to like happy ever after, that they would come back to life. But, you know, we don't know when in the course of that 100 years. I'm assuming in the latter 50 years of that 100 years is when all of those princes went to the kingdom and tried to force their way into the hedge. So they died with their own hubris. You know, they fucked around then found out. Of course, how much of that was their own, you know, bravado and how much of that was poor information? If people told them what they knew, which happened to be untrue, it's like, oh yeah, there's a giant in there, there's a evil witches in there, there's, you know, a princess in there, you just have to go rescue her. That's what they knew. They went on their, you know, epic masculine bravado courageous journey to go through the wicked hedge and paid the ultimate price. So, I don't know. Mixed feelings about that particular aspect, but I do think that like every single one of these panels, every single one of these like drawings or I guess printings were just beautifully done throughout the whole thing. I don't even know which picture I love the most. They were all so beautiful. These multicolor ones are probably some of my favorites, so this this epic first one is pretty good. Yeah. The negative space of using the briars throughout and then the negative space showing the tattered remnants of their clothes is really cool. So, let's it's a nice happy Friday. I'm ending a little bit early. Thank you for all of you that sat through copious amounts of ads while I was dealing with work related stuff um, at my end of business day. Let me find a wonderful person to go visit. I see Sino is on. It'd be nice if Tiger Faye was on. Cough, Tiger Faye, cough, cough. Um, let's see. Is there any, to be fair, let's see. What is, who done did it? Lakavichita. Yeah. I'm glad that you could catch it too, Kat. I'm really glad that you were here for part of it. Um, is Neff on? Neff would be a good person to jump to. Is anybody else on in the space of reading fun? Who do we have? We have loading ready run under reading fun category, playing Magic the Gathering. Yeah, no, that's not how that works. Reading Fighting Phillies, Portland Sea. What? I really feel like people are just not utilizing this category correctly. And I will fight fiercely with Neff by my side into the foray of reading fun and provide an entertainment, or in my case, a relaxing sphere in which you can enjoy. Yeah, yeah, I'll tell him. I'll tell him. Yeah, put it in Dukes. Let's go. Um, just doing all the fucking weird voices. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Uh, let's see. Just chatting, just chatting. Special events, Risk of Rain, Overwatch, Splatoon. Splatoon might be nice. Titorito is doing. Nope. I think they're doing Overwatch as well. You know, I don't think you all have seen Red Lethal Panda before. They're a part of I think the Underrealm that Aloria, Tiny Draculina, and Waldosis are all part of. I think Elmo is also part of that as well, upon hindsight. But I do believe he is part of the Underrealm as well. Um, Cute little red panda, you can't get enough. He's currently playing Tekken 8, which isn't really a great thing to segue into, but it is very tempting. Just it's so hard because it's like, hey, I just went from reading to insert game content here. It's like if I had a couple of like my go-to artists, it would be nice. I think we went to Jinx last time, so um Fallout New Vegas, Minecraft, content warning. Why is it a content warning? Uh-huh. We'll just give that the miss. I think everybody plays games but me. When is Mr. Bear gonna start streaming, Tiger? He needs to start reading. I need somebody at this time to jump into. Actually, Harley is on. Harley would be good. Talos, but Brain is dead. Do you think? I told him, shake my head. Is Harley gonna be on for a little bit longer? Because I'd hate to like jump into somebody's stream when they're gonna be closing. Tell him to relax. Yeah, absolutely. Just okay. Well, let's go visit Harley then. Do do do. How now I've got that song. I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. I sleep all night and I work all day. He's a lumberjack and he's okay. He sleeps all night and he works all day. Yeah. Got Monty Python stuck in my head. Oh my god. Yeah, let's do it. I have faith in Harley being on at least 15 more minutes. And all of you dear Librophiles that stuck around to listen, I appreciate. Yeah, we ballin'. We're going for it. Let's go. Choo choo! Catch the raid train. Um uh leaving, yes. Leaving the library. Something vexing raid. Of course. I, that anyone wants to is fantastic to me, and all of you wonderful people that listen, I appreciate each and every one of you. There's a nice little quick raid message. Do do do. I'll write that one of these days. I'll get that as a button so we can just yeah, there we go. Maybe I should change it to tired of sleeping. Leaving the library. I don't know. I'm just being silly. Okay, so let's go to Harley Quinn. There you are. Our dear, lovely Harley. All right. Thank you, dear listeners. Thank you for joining me on this raid to Harley. I appreciate each and every one of you. Let's go visit Harlequin and their game, even though, quote, they are brain dead. I will catch you all next week on Wednesday, where we begin Anne of Green Gables. So hang on to your britches. Let's go!